Okay, so good evening. Welcome all. Lots been happening. Obviously, Liverpool have signed Thiago on a pretty decent transfer fee of roughly around £20 million with some add-ons. So there could be add-ons there. So that's a good, solid squad addition that I think strengthens their midfield and their midfield depth. He's not the most outstanding player, but it does strengthen their position in midfield. Gareth Bale, obviously, looks very set to go to Tottenham. Sign a loan deal? Question mark. Still over his salary, his fitness, and whether he can actually fit into the team that he left all those years ago. Tottenham has changed since he left there, and yeah, Daniel Levy will have some questions to answer over the how much of the wages they're paying. Obviously, in the NRL, Brisbane look likely to get the wooden spoon, and Penrith have already attained the minor premiership with a game to spare, and they're aiming to go for this record of only losing one game in a regular season, the disrupted season. We'll get on to that. The Tour de France is heating up. Tomorrow is the time trial. There is a mountain right at the end of the time trial. So that's going to be interesting. There could be bike changes. That'll be something to watch tomorrow. And there are some other things going on in sport. Obviously, with more lockdown restrictions being brought into the north of England, any plans to allow fans back into stadiums by October, I think, has gone out the window. Yes, the Islanders lost. It's going to be a Tampa Stanley Cup appearance against Dallas. That'll be interesting. Both those teams are going for a second Stanley Cup win. So that's going to be a very, very interesting Stanley Cup final. Not one that I think people would have actually had money on going into the play-in round and then the full-on playoffs. On the Bale situation, it's going to be interesting to see how much of the salary Real Madrid pay. And yeah, questions will have to be asked about Daniel Levy and signing off on this, considering that we'll use Danny Rose as an example. I like using Danny Rose as an example because he makes himself so easy to be an example of. But he was asking for a salary increase before his loan moved to Newcastle. He's on 50 grand a week. He wanted 100, and they turned him down. So interesting that the amount of salary that Bale is on per week, 600,000. How much will Real Madrid be willing to pay, considering he's still a contracted Real Madrid player, and how much will Tottenham be forking out? What time's the Stanley Cup begin in the UK? Well, we're 5 hours ahead of the East Coast, and technically Dallas is, I think, 6-7 hours behind. So you have to allow that time difference. Texas is Central Time Zone. So the East Coast is 5 hours. That's 7 hours behind, or 6.5 hours behind. So you have to allow that time difference. So you assume if it's an afternoon game, let's say 4 o'clock, it will be 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. In the evening, our time, when games will be broadcast, because there are some broadcast rights that some of the British broadcasters do have for the NHL. On the side, is the Premier League the best league in the world? That is an open-ended question. Very open-ended question. It's going to be interesting to see how Gareth Bale adapts his game back to the English game, considering he hasn't played in it for, I think, six years now. And he is injury prone. And you have to ask about his commitment and where his head's at. Does Tampa have the better team? Well, Stamkos hasn't really been involved in these Stanley Cups. I think he's been injured. But Dallas have had more rest because they beat the Golden Knights in, I think, 5. So Dallas have those extra days of preparation. Now, we are still in the bubble, obviously, in the NHL. And I think what the NHL did was leading the way in North American sports and getting their sports resumed. Tampa's in Florida. Tampa is Tampa Bay. That's Florida. It's I think just north of Jacksonville and near Tallahassee. So it's on the west coast of Florida, in the Gulf of Mexico side of the state of Florida. Obviously, Dallas is also on the Gulf of Mexico as well. But they're playing all the Stanley Cup games up in Canada because of the COVID restrictions, and you just got to look at the mess that the US is in. But it is interesting that this is not a final I don't think a lot of people would have expected, considering that Dallas have struggled in the playoffs since their Stanley Cup win in '99. They really haven't achieved what they could have over the last 20 years. And Tampa, they've been to Stanley Cup finals before, and they've come up short regularly in the playoffs. They do come up come up short. And I think last year losing to Columbus and being completely dismantled by that Columbus side, I think that raises a lot of questions. On the Odell Beckham Jr. accusations, I'm not 100% certain what's really going on in the NFL. I haven't been following it. I'm going to have to have a quick little check now. This means I have to go on the internet and update myself. I haven't really been following any of the NFL preseason. He is a big selling point for the NFL. Big, selling point. It's like not quite the level of LeBron James in the NBA, but he's a big marketing tool for the NFL. So let's have a look. Right, what's this on the Guardian? Let's have a look. Things aren't going well for Odell Beckham Jr. in Cleveland. Spectate with the Browns. They were steamrolled by the Ravens. Yep. Let's have a look. Right. Let's have a look. See what's going on. Cleveland saying a new beginning. Beckham's production is dipped. Conventional. Well, they're saying that he could be traded. That'd be interesting. But God, it looks like he's going to be traded out. I can't really. Oh, look. Water sports. That's something. Well, let's just go through things. Technically, that's not illegal, but it's not a PR image the NFL wants, with more players having off-field indiscretions or salacious stories, because the NFL is full of players having accusations or rumors of infidelity, assault allegations, regular misbehavior. And it's a thing the NFL has a problem with. It never seems to get on top of. The NFL seems to have a massive issue. With players getting up to no good, and it never seems to shed this stigma of, oh well, yeah, these are their stereotype, but there's a lot of accusations against a lot of NFL players, past and present, of domestic violence, drug offences, animal cruelty with Michael Vick, sexual assault allegations. There's been a litany of misbehaviour, got firearms violations, narcotic violations. The NFL does have a lot of this. I'll get onto the Stanley Cup questions in a minute, because how you work out ratings. I think the Leafs Rangers would be impossible because they both play in the Eastern Conference, so you'd have to change conferences and then how the playoffs are structured on that one. On the NFL players being stereotyped, unfortunately, they make it themselves easy to be stereotyped with a lot of their antics. And quite honestly, looking at the list of current and past players who've been accused of domestic violence, been accused of, assault allegations, been accused of a whole variety. It doesn't seem to go away. And every season, there's always one or two or three or four, a handful that make the headlines. Substance abuse is a problem, and then you have to link that with the CTE side of things and concussions. Now, this is something I'm going to get onto, because today an ex-AFL player, won a lawsuit over concussions. He was one of the few professional sportsmen in the 90s to take out a life insurance policy in Australia, and it's paid dividends, because through his life insurance policy, he's won a lawsuit against the AFL for about 1.6 million Australian dollars, about £800,000 he's been paid out by the AFL over concussion-related health issues that he's had. And mental health is part of that discussion. And the NFL, coming to terms with their CT lawsuit and paying out silly amount of money to ex-players, tells you that the sport itself, the athlete welfare, and how these guys are advised and looked after by their agents and their management companies. There's a lot going on that the NFL needs to clear up, and No, the AFL isn't a $1 billion league, but it still had to pay out a couple of $1 million to this ex-player, including legal costs. So he's got his own settlement plus the legal costs. So the AFL have admitted liability and not looking after. No, I think you'll find the AFL is actually the wealthier league. It has higher attendances, got more teams, more financial stability than the NRL. Has a wider TV audience in Australia. They're about comparable, I would say, in finance. Um, on the side of the NFL, yeah, the fact that another major sports league has admitted personal liability on an individual case, I think, is going to set the ball rolling with more ex-players coming out and going through litigation over how concussions, when they were concussed, or other injuries, because I always add that to the conversation because that is crucial. Because when you have debilitating shoulder and back and knee, you can suffer from mental health issues as well. The NFL can afford to look after, you know, um, its players. It can afford to look after its players, past and present, their health, their well-being, and their post. Because you look at the amount of NFL players who end up being bankrupt and on welfare payments. The average salaries are skewed by the top end quarterbacks and running backs and wide receivers. Your average salary is not that high in the NFL. The average salary overall is a quantitative thing, and it is skewed by the top end talent. Big Bash, and you've got the Sheffield Shield, which is the first class, similar to the county game here, and then you've got the Big Bash League, which is the T20 equivalent. That in itself, Canberra and the Northern Territory don't have teams in the Sheffield Shield, which actually detracts from the depth of playing talent. So Cricket Australia's got problems. They do get bigger numbers for Australian domestic cricket. They do. It's taken far more seriously as a sport, but Cricket Australia has its own struggles. It does get a bigger TV audience because it is treated more seriously as a sport. When the AFL and the NRL are done, a lot of fans turn to cricket. So when the winter sports, as they would call them, which take place in our summer, are done, they play cricket, and the conditions in Australia for cricket are brilliant. There's a reason why they've got so many good fast bowlers who come out of Australia who can bowl faster than the West Indians or the Brits or the Indians. It's the way their wickets work and the conditions, the bowling conditions. But if I can get back to the NFL, because obviously Adele Beckham Jr. having his sex allegations, he's done nothing illegal. It's just not necessarily the most pleasant thing for some people. Other people, it's an everyday activity. But on the NFL side of things, looking after their players past and present, the league can afford to do that. There's enough money, right? There is enough money that the league generates in revenue that they can actually look after all their players past and present. Same can be said of the NHL, Major League Baseball. I wouldn't say it should be illegal. Then you're getting onto freedom of expression and what people do behind closed doors with consenting adults. That debate's been had with proposed government legislation that's been defeated in this country in relation to online content. Again, it's not as socially taboo as it used to be, but I can understand the question being raised. But as I was getting at with the NFL and looking after past players, it has a poor track record in looking after their welfare when they're retired. A lot of them are badly advised what to do with their money, and careers can be brutally short. And the CTE lawsuit has highlighted a massive welfare issue because it's more than just CTE. It's more than just repeat concussions. It's all the other injuries that go with a contact sport. And you look at the amount of players who've had to retire because of shoulder problems, knee problems, back problems, ankle injuries, not just concussion, the amount of players who've had to retire for other injuries sustained. And they go on long-term injured reserve, they pick up their paychecks, and then they're left to their own devices post-retirement. And not all of them get into coaching, and not all of them stay as ambassadors, and not all of them stay within the sport. Why isn't European football not got rid of nil-nil draws. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Some of the best games I've seen have actually been scoreless draws or scoring draws. Some of the best games I've ever watched have actually been end-to-end, quite open, and it just comes down to two very good goalkeepers, or just that's how the ball rolls. There's always a point to say, I know, because then you have to look at, again, player welfare. That's adding extra minutes onto the body. And if it's a regular season game or a World Cup group, yeah, just leave it 0-0. There's been this debate has been had for years. The NRL decided to go and bring in the golden point, and still a lot of games end up in draws. We've seen a draw or two this season. So I would personally say leave it in there. I think playing extra time on top of that, we already argue about fixture congestion, but I wouldn't say they're necessarily the worst thing in sports. I generally think that's a fair reflection of the game. You might have one side that's solely attacking and one team solely defending, and if that's the case, then yeah, you could get a bit of a stale match. But then it just also proves that both sides were tactically even. I think there has been a debate about scrapping draws altogether. That met with a lot of resistance from players as well. You have to take in consideration the managers and the players and their feedback. That they're the participants. A lot of fans, sometimes if you're in a relegation battle, a draw can mean staying up or going down. I think the debate's been had. Other sports have tried to get rid of draws. The NHL now has the shootout and overtime. The NRL has golden point. And they brought in overtime to get rid of ties in the NHL. And the amount of games still going to the shootout is still a reasonable percentage as what it was when the shootout was introduced. So that really hasn't necessarily got rid of two sides who battle each other to a standstill. I think I don't think there is actually the appetite to bring in a massive rule change. It's always been in the rule book. Other sports have tinkered with it. Rugby league and the NHL have definitely brought in things, but that still means you're going about extra added time, and that's added time that these athletes have to be on the field or on the ice. And if you get an injury playing golden point or 3-on-3 overtime, and you get injured after the end of regulation, that is a coach killer. That is something that coaches get infuriated by. Again, changing the point system, that hasn't been done for a very, very long time. And there seems to be no real move by FIFA or the FA or whatever organisation in place to do that. There doesn't seem to be the appetite for that kind of structural change to the game. We're already having enough problems with VAR. So they can't even get the technology to work. And this is the situation that professional sport finds itself in. Is yes, other sports have tinkered with trying to eliminate ties to a varying level of success. And it's mostly been in recent times. It's only been in the last 20 years. And it's generally designed for TV. It's not necessarily just designed for those fans in attendance. And you also have to, bring in that player and coach feedback. They're the ones who really are the ones playing the game, coaching the game. It is an interesting one. There's a reason why football is the global sport, in the sense that it's played in every continent at a professional level, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why other sports are lagging behind. It's been pretty stable with how the rules are implemented concerning, how goals are scored, nil-nils, and etc. Extra time. It's been pretty consistent and stable. What would you suggest to improve a sport? Wow, that's a good one. That is a good one. From a viewing point of view or a playing point of view, because what I've seen in the NRL in recent weeks is their video referee system is starting to come under more scrutiny. And rugby league used to actually be pretty good with the video refereeing system, but I think there's still human error there. Well, it's an interesting one. It's a very difficult one. As someone who's played a bit of sport, I would think. I think rules concerning more player welfare, I think, are vital, especially to do with concussions and mandatory rest periods. That's something I would bring in as as a sports administrator, and that debate is being had with this AFL lawsuit. It was stated in the closing statements that there are recommendations that should be brought to the fore that if there is a concussion of a player, and it doesn't matter what contact sport, then that player has a mandatory stand down period, regardless if he's passed or failed the head injury assessment. Once you've had to leave the field for that head injury assessment, even if you pass the cognitive test, there should still be a mandatory rest period and regular evaluation by independent medical advice. That's something I would bring in. And that's from a playing standpoint, although I no longer participate in sport because I'm now, 30, nearly 31. I need shoulder surgery. I need back surgery. And that is sporting related injuries from when I was younger, and road traffic collisions have done that. But if I was still playing rugby, I would say yes, mandatory stand down period for anyone suspected of or having a concussion. Any kind of head injury that requires the player to leave the field, to have a head injury assessment that isn't a blood bin, like a blood patch up, I would say, even if they pass the cognitive tests, I would say have a mandatory rest period and an independent doctor panel of neurologists set up by that league professionally, because they can afford it, to assess those players on a regular basis until that mandatory period is up. And if they still feel that player is not suitable to return, then extend the mandatory rest period. On a pure playing point of view, I think that applies. On a fan's point of view, as watching the sport, that is an interesting one with a rule change to improve the sport. I think it comes down to the players have to buy in first, and the coaches have to buy in first before any kind of fan kind of any kind of fan involvement gets involved with viewing. I think you have to get the players on board first with experimental rules, and then you have to go from there. But I think that the head injury assessments, I think there needs to be a compulsory stand down period, and I think that it needs to be enforced with independent medical side of things, because I've definitely seen players in ice hockey, rugby league, rugby union return to the field who I believe shouldn't have over the last 5 years since they've got more strict on the concussion protocols. I have seen players return who I think, hang on a second, he has just been polaxed. He was jelly. And I've seen a few instances over the last couple of weeks in the NRL where that player is definitely not coming back. And if they do have that magical, they passed the HIA, what? And you're thinking, how? How is that player being deemed okay when he's clearly not fit when he leaves the field and he's clearly groggy? That to me is a concussion and a brain hemorrhage waiting to happen. Do I have any interest in watching Mike Tyson fight? I've gone completely off boxing. There is no interest for me now with the sport in general. There's too many issues within the sport for me to enjoy it. I've completely zoned out. I have no interest in watching a 50-year-old come back to fight another 50-year-old, because that's just what you class as common assault down the pub on a Friday night. I have no interest in that being entertainment. I think that is just something I have no interest in at all. But on the Odell Beckham Jr., it looks likely he's going to be traded out to Cleveland Browns. That's the best solution for the team and player. But no, there's some interesting points. I mean, the debate about 0-0 draws, what was if it's a scoring draw? What was if it's 3-3? Because you're saying get rid of 0-0s. But what about a 1-1 or 2-2 or 3-3? Are you saying that all draws have to be removed from football? Because that in itself, you're saying you want to get rid of the 0-0, but then you want to keep the scoring draw? I don't get that, because the same amount of points is awarded for a draw, and it's always been in the football rule book that a draw is classed as a point. So that is an interesting subplot if you want to change how should we have draws left in league football. In knockout football, you have the extra time of penalties because it's written into the rule book. But in league games, in group games, in competitions, a 0-0 is an acceptable result. And the rule book states that. but I don't see any movement from FIFA or any national FA to bring in a rule change. And football is one of those few sports that actually has a unified rule book across the board, unlike rugby league or IIHF or NHL ice hockey. It's one of the few sports that actually has a unified rule book across the board for the game. So I can't see any interest from the governing body to remove that and alter that in any way. I mean, they tried the golden goal, that no longer exists. And you've got to think of it from the fans' point of view as well, and the players and the coaches. That there has to be fan involvement if these rule changes, player involvement, and coach involvement. You have to have the stakeholders get involved, because at the end of the day, if they're in favour of keeping the system as it is, then what's the point in changing a system that they don't want changed? The changes I would make would be more around player welfare and in football, I would definitely look at the interpretation of the offside rule, because that's become a mess. They need to simplify that. They've overcomplicated the language in the ruling. Rugby union, they need to look at scrums and get them scrummaging properly, because that's become an absolute mess. Rugby league, I think rugby league and the NRL has got their rules pretty good at the moment, but there's a few areas they can improve on. In regards to the video refs, the NRL bunkers had a nightmare the last couple of weeks, and when you've got the head of refereeing coming out and people are actually watching his press conferences, that tells you that the officials have had a poor run of things, and there has been some pretty poor officiating in recent weeks. So that's another thing that I think we need to look at, is addressing issues with refereeing standards, because I think they're either too reliant on technology or the technology is failing. And that's something that needs to be addressed by all the stakeholders again, because that becomes embarrassing when you have this system like the NRL bunker and it's costing them a lot of money. And the mistakes that have been made in recent weeks have been really bad. And it has affected the outcome of games somewhat, and how the game is flowing and the momentum swings. There was a try that shouldn't have been given in the Rabbitohs Bulldogs game. That did change the momentum for a brief period, where South Sydney got back in the game. His foot is clearly dead in touch before he rounds the ball in the in goal area. There was a try disallowed today for Parramatta that should have been given, and that was a refereeing foul up on the field with Henry Perinara. There was the Roosters try that was disallowed for apparent obstruction, which there was, what's the player supposed to do in the play of the ball? So there's been a few glaring errors highlighted in the media and by fans, and social media has had a lot to do with it as well. They are glaring errors, and the head of when you've got the head of a refereeing union, the head of referees coming out, and a lot more people are watching his press conference than let's say the post-match conferences with the players and the coaches. That tells you that the referees and the refereeing system has made a terrible series of errors. And when they're all getting highlighted and they're changing the composition of how the video ref works mid-season, that tells you. And we're a week away from finals in the NRL, and that is troubling, because I'm a Raiders fan and we got screwed over last season in the grand final, again with a refereeing blunder that has rankled with Raiders fans for 12 months. And imagine if that decision happens to your team. It's the same with VAR in football and how it's been badly implemented, and it has become a bit farcical, and the Premier League is really screwing it up. As I always keep saying, the 2018 World Cup, they had it right. That is a Yotes jumper. Yep, it's my Yotes hoodie. I've put all my hockey jerseys away in my wardrobe, and it's still too warm to wear them, because it's nearly been 30 degrees all week, so it's still too warm to wear them. But this is actually quite comfortable to lounge around in. But yeah, this is my Yotes hoodie. It comes out every now and then. But yes, this is the concern, because obviously not that long ago, the Scottish government was suggesting the beginning of this week initially was when they were going to allow fans back in. The national government, the UK government, was saying the beginning of October. That doesn't look like it's going to happen. and that's a concern. That's one of the reasons why the EIHL, the Elite League Ice Hockey in the UK, said it's indefinitely suspending this coming season, because it relies on ticket sales, and it relies on at least 75% capacity in arenas for teams to make a profit. But I can't see that happening over here. In the Tour de France, they've banned fans from the summit of certain climbs in certain areas of the road courses. So I can't see these restrictions in Europe because the cases in Europe are skyrocketing. And I can't. This is the problem. This is where, if we do go into another lockdown, what will happen to sport? So when everyone's saying, "Oh yeah, football's back, we've got a new season," rugby union's back, we're finishing off the season, we're going to have these autumn tests, this Eight Nations kind of tournament, rugby league's resuming. That's all well and good, but if we go into a full national lockdown again, that creates a problem because we could have sport suspended again. And the financial implications. I mean, look at Macclesfield; they've been wound up this week. I mean, Southend have got a winding up order in October. So football is, as predicted by the Huddersfield owner during lockdown, 50, 60 clubs could go out of business. We are starting to see clubs go out of business. Southend have a winding up petition at the High Court coming. Macclesfield eventually did get relegated, and Stevenage had a reprieve. And the concern is for me is if that does come to pass, sport. The sports will survive. I've always said this. The sports will survive, but the shape of the sport on a professional and amateur level and clubs, that's what's it going to look like when we come out the other side of this? Because what's basically been covered up, I wouldn't say covered up's what we were saying, but what's happened over many years is poor financial management at club level, which is the private side of things, and in the administration of sport. And what this crisis over the last 9 months, because it was actually starting last year in China at this time last year, there's already cases being reported. But what's happened since the end of last year, beginning of this year, all the way through to now, is these weaknesses in the financial side of sport and the governance side of sport have been massively exposed. And people are always saying, when's the football money bubble going to burst? I think it's starting to burst now, because if too many clubs go out of business, the sport cannot sustain itself. You have to see it as like a tower block or a pyramid. If you start removing blocks from the bottom, the top will collapse inwards. And this is what's concerning. And when you have high-profile players, especially on international duty in Iceland, Foden and Greenwood misbehaving and breaching the lockdown bubble, it doesn't help. And it doesn't help the situation. And I fear for lower level professional sport and semi-pro sport, and the amateur side of grassroots sports are going to be devastated. But at the top end, there's been reckless financial mismanagement and overspending for 20 to 30 years. Scottish football will be decimated, absolutely decimated. Of that, I have no doubt. Rugby union is really financially struggling right now. Look at cricket, the ECB laying off staff. The concern that I have is the sports, as I say, will survive. The sports will survive. People will still play them. The rules are there, so we can read the rule, but they will still survive. But what gets me is the way certain sports handled March through to May and June. That initial 3-4 month period. Some sports, it was agreed across the board, we're going to have to take pay cuts, and it was up to each individual club to work out with their playing groups. Football just had no idea what to do. And when the PFA came out and said, don't take pay cuts and wage deferrals, that just shows how out of touch that particular sport is with society. It's written into their contracts that they have to do their, charity work. Football really mishandled everything. Premier League and the EFL and the clubs and the PFA and the players were all at war with each other. and the fans were well. The social media reactions to furloughing non-playing staff at some of these big Premier League clubs was pretty visceral. Tottenham furloughs non-playing staff, sign Gareth Bale on loan. How much of his £600,000 a week wages are they paying? How can they justify that? Other sports are having to go to the government and go, can you lend us money so we can survive? So the sports will survive. How many teams survive coming out of this? That's another question. But there is clearly an imbalance financially. There's clearly mismanagement financially. There's clearly poor governance across the board. And the example I always use for good governance and good management, I would say look at Australia, look at the NRL, look at the AFL, look how they managed to restart their team sports. They've got fans back in attendance. You just have to look at the difference in how the Australians and the Kiwis have dealt with the lockdown and getting professional sport going and fans back into stadiums. And then you look up in the Northern Hemisphere and it's an absolute shambles. Absolute shambles. And at the end of the day, sport will look very, very different. But there has to be massive structural changes to how sport is run, how it's governed, the finances, where the money goes. You have to ask the question of the ECB, for example. They've announced these massive financial losses. They've had 15 years of a Sky Sports TV deal worth a lot of money. Where's all the money gone? That's the question the ECB has to answer and be transparent about it. It's just saying we're cutting 62 jobs from the ECB, or equivalent to 20% of their budget. That's 1/5 of their direct employees. That's not including subcontractors who've just lost their jobs. Celtic and Rangers, but then if Scotland goes into some kind of border lockdown, Celtic and Rangers wouldn't be able to be on the same level of competitiveness against some of the English league clubs. And if they were to apply to join, they would have to start at the bottom because there'll be protests from other clubs that have had to reform, enter the league system. But then Scottish football will be dead anyway, because you take the old firm out. All you've got left is Aberdeen and the Edinburgh clubs for fan base to really drive the game forward. And if you take your two biggest fan bases out of the equation and the biggest moneymaker for the league, you've just killed the league completely. Look at Welsh football; it's not great without Cardiff, Swansea, and Newport and Wrexham in the Welsh system. It's not watchable. So if Celtic and Rangers, there was already the idea about 20 years ago when the Premier League was first set up on Sky Sports, some TV executives, some really dopey bastards came up with the idea of taking Celtic and Rangers out of Scottish football in the 90s. That idea has been on the table for 20, 30 years. It's never gained any serious traction. And again, I can't see Rangers and Celtic wanting to do that, because then that will affect Scotland's European qualification hopes for clubs. And I can't see Kilmarnock, St Johnstone and Aberdeen really being a driving force behind Scottish football somehow and making the same revenue. It would kill the sport in Scotland if they were to leave. Plain and simple. The only other way to save Scottish football is to merge it with the English league system, merge some of the smaller clubs, which like Dundee and Dundee United. I mean, that would be an interesting one. If they were to merge, become Dundee City, for example, that'd be kind of interesting. But to take Celtic and Rangers and possibly Aberdeen and some of the Edinburgh clubs out, that would be disastrous. The only way Scottish football would, if that was to happen, would be the whole Scottish league system to merge with the English league system. And then that creates logistical nightmares and all sorts of problems, because there's a whole range of issues financially with Scottish football. I've discussed it for a long time. Dortmund do have a good track record with their youth policy. That's a well-known fact, but they still have a lot of experienced players at the club who are hardened, seasoned professionals, so they can blend the youth with the experience. That's how you get a good squad together. You need some youngsters, but you need some senior players, and that's Dortmund have got that balance right. So Bayern Munich. In fact, the German system is built upon that, and that's why German clubs are generally very, very successful over long periods of time. And Bayern Munich being dominant is only more of a recent thing in recent decades. Before the 70s, they weren't as dominant. It was Borussia Mönchengladbach were the dominant side in the 70s in German football, and Dortmund and Hanover and Werder Bremen. There was a lot of clubs that were more dominant. It's always historically it's been a very competitive league system, and I think Bayern, their race will eventually be run, and the gap is closing on them. So I'm not sure Bayern Munich will be the dominant force forever in German football. It goes through phases. I mean, Man United were the dominant force for the better part of 2 decades. Liverpool before that for the better part of 2 decades. Be surprised no Wolves were once the most dominant team in English football. Aston Villa have had their period of dominance. If you look through the history books, there's periods where some clubs are the dominant force, but other clubs also win trophies. It's the issue is when it becomes like a one-team league and the other teams just compete for second place, and that's the French league system. But I can't see that lasting forever. I think there's cracks appearing in PSG's dominance and facade. But for many years, Lyon, I think, won 4 straight. I think Lyon won 4 straight league titles in France in the early 2000s. They were the dominant force. No one was complaining about French football being uncompetitive then because they didn't win every single trophy that the French football system has to offer. Blackburn were dominant in the FA Cup for a very long time. First team to win it 5 times. So there's certain, certain periods of dominance where certain teams dominate a certain competition or a certain league, but it doesn't last forever. It doesn't last forever. That's a fact. But success is built upon stability, and Munich and Dortmund and Hamburg, Bremen, Mönchengladbach, at various times of the dominant side, they had stability. I think if you look at the Premier League era, the second half of it, the first half is Man United's dominance, with Arsenal and Blackburn winning the odd title here or there. But then you get to the second half, and it's more of a mix. More teams have won the title, and so you have to factor that in mind. There's no era of dominance now in the Premier League. It was Man United's league with a few other teams occasionally winning a trophy. Now it's if you get into the top 6 one season, you have the opportunity the next season to win the league. And it's a far more competitive league at the top now than what it was. Regardless of Liverpool's record-breaking and Man City's record-breaking seasons in recent years, Leicester have now become a top 6 side, and they look ready to take that next step again. So they could win a second Premier League title this season. We just don't know. Chelsea have obviously, under the Abramovich era, become very successful. So that's another hat thrown in the mix. So the English league system is more competitive because if you look at the top 6, top 8 teams, look at all the titles in there. And then you've got Blackburn in the Championship, also a Premier League winner who may get back in the league. And if you look at that, there are teams outside the Premier League who've won the old Division 1 as well floating around. So the composition of league titles is more spread in English football in historically and recently. Spanish football, you could say, not enough competition. Italian football, however, is very interesting. There's been a lot of Serie A winners in Italian football. It's not just Juventus's league. That is a very interesting league to look at. Post 1945 is generally where you want to look at it from. Pre 1945, obviously, is the fascist era, but 1946 onwards, the Italian league system is really interesting to look at and who's won what. There's a lot of trophies shared around a lot of clubs, and that is a fun league to look at. And some clubs have won less trophies than you might think, and others have won more. It is generally interesting. And Torino used to be the more successful out of Torino and Juventus for a period. There was a period where they were the big club, and they were winning the trophies, and Juventus weren't. So it's not always been Juventus being the most dominant force in Italian football. You will see a lot of trophies scattered around Italian football. But that's another thing. I mean, success. I mean, a good barometer is club stability. That's always a good barometer about how successful a team is going to be, and to be a successful team, you do need stability, not only behind the bench but in the boardroom. So the off field, you need stability on the playing field. You need a settled squad where you not completely overhaul, but you keep drip feeding new talent in, and you squad management. You don't have to keep making massive signings every season and move players on. And to look at the health of the league, you look at how many winners that league's had in that league's existence, and then you take it sample size over a 10-year period. So here's the thing: you look at the NRL and you look at the Super League and Rugby League, for example. I always use this as an example. I've done this example before. You look at the amount of teams that have had grand final appearances, and you look at the teams that have actually won the grand final as well. The NRL tops that for competitiveness. The Super League, it's the same 4 clubs that win all the time. There's only 8 teams that have made the Super League grand final. The Challenge Cup is a different thing. And in the Challenge Cup, you look at how successful teams are as well, and you again go by 10-year segments and then the overall health of the competition. So the Challenge Cup is a bit more competitive; more teams win that. But if you look at the actual league, the Super League and the NRL is more competitive. I think there's only 2 teams not to win a grand final currently in the top tier in first grade, and I think there's only 1 team that hasn't had a grand final appearance in first grade in the NRL currently. Whereas in Super League, it's since the change from the old Division 1 to the Super League, that hasn't translated to be the case. The same clubs seem to always be at the top, and I think that's part of the problem with the British or the European promotion relegation system to some point. The Serie A, Italian football in the 80s and the 90s was definitely the top league in the world for talent. I remember growing up with it. It was a pleasure watching it on a Sunday, the live match on the Sunday and the highlight show. It was definitely, I really enjoyed watching it, and there were star players at every team. That's not the case anymore. Although the quality level is starting to improve again. They've gone through a lean spell for the last 14, 15 years, has Italian, and that is a general fact. There's no escaping that. But they're still in the top 5 leagues in the world. Look. On the Greenwood off-field antics and Solskjaer and Southgate getting in a war of words, or the press overinflating what's been said. This is what gets me about, especially professional all sports. When we talk about the NFL and their list of off-field antics and indiscretions where it brings the sport into disrepute. European football players, exactly the same. Exactly the same. They're paid a lot of money very, very young. They're scouted from a young age, so they're already in the system from a young age, and they're sort of in a little bubble away from reality. A lot of them at the top level. And his antics on the England camp, I'm not surprised Southgate sent him home in disgrace. On the side of Man United, on their covering it up, other players have also. I mean, Jack Grealish. His indiscretions have been very, very public. Obviously, this is now the era of social media. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, Paul Gascoigne, regularly known as a bit of a maverick off the field, got up to plenty of mischief. Brilliant player. Did it affect his career? Yes, it did. Ultimately, it did. But this is again down to the player agents, the club, the representatives, and those advising these players, to do the right thing. I mean, Kyle Walker, look at some of his antics over lockdown. I think, yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, a lot of these. Well, I'm not condoning their behaviour. Not at all. I mean, the Canterbury Bulldogs had to suspend 2 players indefinitely, and now they've both been allowed to play again. One's left the club for similar indiscretions on a pre-season tour. This is the issue, especially if you are scouted from a young age. They've been part of a system, right? A part of a system from the age of 11, if not younger, in linked with these professional clubs. They get their first professional contracts, I think, when they're 16 or 17, and they don't live in reality. They don't. And I think I think this is part of the problem. Is that they have this sense of entitlement, and I always say this: it's a privilege, not a right, to be a professional athlete. It's a privilege, not a right. It's a privilege, and that privilege can be taken away very, very quickly. And you just look at the amount of high-profile sports stars who've fallen from grace in acrimonious circumstances because of off-field indiscretions. The list is long, very long. I mean, Ben Cousins is a prime example from the AFL in Australia. That was big news down there. Big news. I mean, the antics he got up to. And then you got the fact is there's allegations of him regularly misbehaving at club level. Doesn't surprise me. You know, there is a sort of, but you have to ask the question about how his player representatives, his agent, his manager, the club themselves. There needs to be a code of conduct, a league wide or a football league wide that includes the Premier League code of conduct, because the amount of indiscretions these players get up to off the field is ridiculous. And a lot of young people, boys and girls, will idolise these people. And then because it's constantly seen as okay, because not enough stringent action is taken and disciplining these players for their off-field indiscretions. But look at Kyle Walker; he was allowed to go on the England. Look, I think a message needs to be sent that disrespecting the setup, disrespecting the coach. There's a reason, and now you can see why there's a reason why Phil Foden isn't playing as much as at Man City, because his talent is not questioned. He's exceptionally skillful. And you look at Gareth Bale at Madrid; he was just pissing around on the bench like it was just like it's a school game. So attitude has to be questioned. But I think it's a culture within the sport. There's a massive ignorance of the wider world. I think Kyle Walker. There are some concerns, but bad behaviour, if it's not punished, is seen as a reward. So those behavioural traits continue. And there seems to be a massive culture problem within the sport. We've had the same discussion about drug use in sport and alcohol abuse. And professional, there needs to be a balance where you can have a few beers with the lads after a win or a loss, and you can do those team bonding things. And then there's what we're going through right now. There's this massive social upheaval with the coronavirus, and there are rules in place to protect people. And if you're going to flout them, then that shows disrespect to the coach. It shows disrespect to your teammates who are obeying by the rules. And it shows disrespect to the profession yourself. But unfortunately, football's had this disease of entitlement and not giving. You have to ask the question: who's advising these lads? And at the same time, it is a culture problem within dressing rooms and within the sport itself. You hear teams talk about good culture, and team unity. I think I don't know. I think you have to make some kind of disciplinary stand and actually sanction the player and say this is not acceptable to misbehave in such a way. Phil Foden, that's just him being an absolute tit. He hasn't broken it well. I have sympathy for his partner, but again, a lot of these wags, and I'm going to call them a wag, wives or girlfriends. They're just as vacuous and as entitled as their football playing partners. And the fact there's stories being leaked now. I mean, you could talk about Wayne Rooney and the granny stories and his exploits, extramarital affairs. Sport, high-profile athletes, they are human beings. They are going to, human nature is to err, to stray. I mean, it's things that happen with normal, people. But I think with their high profile, and the media are going to have a field day because the media want to sell newspapers. They want to sell articles. They want to get clickbait. So the media are going to have a field day. But the football needs to sort itself out, because we've seen this with rugby union, we've seen this with rugby league, we've seen it with cricket. Be it at club level or international level, players have misbehaved. I refer to the Ben Stokes incident, the 2011 Rugby World Cup with England, some of the antics of the Australian rugby players in recent years, rugby league, a couple of Scottish players being refused entry on a flight at the Rugby League World Cup 3 years ago. So the press have a field day when a high profile sports star screws up, or stars screw up. The press go bananas for it, and rugby's had some high profile incidents with some players over the years. Rugby league's had a lot, especially in the NRL. There's definitely got to be a culture shift within the sport, because it has a habit of shooting itself in the foot. And football and the NFL, there definitely needs to be a hard conversation had at club level, at federation level, and at international level about what is expected, because it creates the negative headlines, which then keeps fueling the stereotype that they're playboys, they're paid too much, and you could argue yes, they are overpaid, and a lot of them are playboys and don't live in in the real world. I honestly don't know. I think not. It's an interesting one, but there definitely needs to be some kind of culture shift, and deep conversations need to be had about respect, decent behaviour, actually following regulations. There's a reason why these international, Nations League matches went ahead, and that's with the agreement of European governments going, we are going to allow these matches to take place behind closed doors with these like COVID bubbles in place, and they have breached that, and they should face sanction for it. They're not the only players to get up to no good, not just in the UK, but in Europe. There's been loads. It's a thing. It's frustrating as a fan of sport. We've had to abide by these regulations and take privations. Oh yeah, look, but social media, you can't get away with any indiscretion now. We've seen it across the board. But you have to listen to some of the stories from the 80s and the 90s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s when it comes to some of the antics players got up to, and they could get away with these things. And yeah, Gascoigne is one of those examples of a player who did have some very, very crazy nights out. And if he was playing now, it would be a field day for the media, absolute field day. But again, it comes down to then that comes down, as I say, to some of these issues. These players need better advice. The people advising them aren't doing a very good job. The people around them, you have to question some of their antics with some of the people that they associate with. And the clubs are their employers. I think there has to be some kind of code of conduct, league-wide code of conduct brought in. And when you get selected for your national team, again, a code of conduct of what you've got to adhere to, because we've had too many breaches of curfew on. I mean, look at what happened with Leicester in 2015 in that Thai hotel. That was a mess. It led to the manager losing his job and some players getting binned off. So I think there definitely needs to be some hard conversations had. I don't know how you go about it, how you sanction these players, but well, it's a difficult one, but I do think if we let's say hypothetically, let's say in the workplace we're going to a work conference, and we get up to these antics, we probably lose our jobs for some of the indiscretions these football players get up to. We probably get sacked. Gross misconduct, bringing the company into disrepute, um, and a variety of other things that can be done because when you sign a contract, you sign up to your end of the bargain. Oh yeah, Wimbledon. You know, the crazy gang. They're known for some of their antics. And you know, if the crazy gang were playing today, I think that would create media headlines as well. It did in the 80s and the 90s when they were a team, but if they were playing today and some of those antics, social media, that would make front and back page news. That would sell a lot of newspapers. On the Southgate side of things, with the players he's selecting, he is going with a very young, naive um, squad. And they're having questions about the youth of his squad and the lack of senior players in that team. And they're not going away. And yes, they did well at the World Cup. They got to that semi final. They came up short. But questions have been asked about the age and the maturity of some of these guys. But then some of the senior players aren't much better with some of the antics they get up to. So it's a difficult one what you do and how you sanction these players. I think the FA needs to possibly, get involved because they sanction the Premier League, they sanction these internationals. So they may need to get involved, and if they get involved, I mean, it's a difficult one. But we've been here before with Kane is no captain for me. He doesn't strike me as someone I would follow into battle if he was leading me in a charge. So that's weak leadership on the senior players. That's weak management from Southgate because the fact that they believe they can get away with this shows a complete lack of respect for management and the processes in place. But we've been here before with Danny Cipriani with some of his antics that really harmed his international career. He's one of the most talented fly halves in English rugby union. Didn't go to the World Cup when he should have. And I think if he played against Africa in that final, we might have won that game because he can unlock a defence. And the media were he was informed by his off-field antics. I think did his career in. We've seen it in rugby league in the World Cup a couple of years ago. Players being sent home in disgrace for basically turning up drunk at the airport and being refused access to the flight, being turned away from the flight because they were too drunk. I think it was Danny Brough. I think the Scotland captain was sent home in disgrace. So Flintoff with the pedalo, you've got Ben Stokes and Alex Hales. Alex Hales' career has not recovered from that incident on their night out in Bristol a couple of years back, which I think was a problem and became a massive distraction. So we've been here before with high-profile international players. And yeah, some players, Cipriani and Alex Hales, in their respective sports, their international careers have gone down the toilet because of their off-field antics. Now, this is a key juncture in their careers. They're not getting a lot of game time at club level when they're clearly talented enough. And Southgate doesn't strike me as a disciplinarian and as a manager that's clearly commanding a lot of respect in that dressing room. There doesn't appear to be enough. No, Alex Hales also has some cocaine issues as well. He's been involved in some narcotics. But Alex Hales, his career hasn't fully recovered at all from 2017. He's been involved with some other incidents that don't involve Ben Stokes. Not that Ben Stokes is the most popular guy in the world, but Stokes divides opinion. Alex Hales divides opinion. The Tompkins brothers. One they're both out of Wigan now. One got booted straight away. Joel got gone. Sam Tompkins. That did the rounds. That was quite I'm not going to say unfortunate because apparently they have previous for being arseholes. So they let themselves down badly because, especially Sam Tompkins, high-profile players. Brother Joel's a duffer, absolute thug. Plenty of suspensions on his record for foul play. That one, again, it's older footage, so it wasn't at the time that it was released. It is older footage, but it came out at a very bad time last season, and that was a hammer blow, I think, to the Tompkins brothers. And Wigan were just like, we've got to respond to this. And I think there was no complaints with them getting booted out. I mean, fined, suspended. I didn't hear many complaints from too many rugby league fans about. But rugby league does have an issue, and if you look at the NRL, there's plenty of scandalous off-field indiscretions that players get up to. The Jack Tabellin situation at the St George Illawarra Dragons, that's dragging on. His trials due in November for the charges against him, which are very serious, which could lead up to 15 years in prison. So that in itself is an ongoing situation. And again, it's a culture thing. It's a culture thing. Again, you have to look at how the press would react and how fans would react to these players coming back. Some saying they served their punishment. Others are saying, that as I always say, this is a privilege, not a right, to be a professional athlete. And the problem is, a lot of professional athletes have been scouted from a very young age, haven't worked a real job in the sense of working in a factory, working on a farm, working in an office, a building site, whatever the job may be. They've been scouted from a young age. They've gone through the youth systems. They're already going through the club youth academies. And in North America, high school, they're scouted before their finals, right, when they're 18. They're scouted when they're 15, 16. They're already given offers from universities when they're 16, 17. So they're already in the system. And I think I have limited sympathy because they are professionals. They're over the age of 20. They are classed as adults. They're very highly paid. They are in a very privileged position that most would the issue is the attitude, and it's not just they're young players. Senior players do it as well. This is a culture that has been continually going on for decades, but and I refer back to the Cipriani situation, and one of the reasons why his international career didn't kick on, and he's only played, I think, 15 or 16 tests for England, is his off-field antics and the negative press that comes with that. And the same can be said in the aftermath of the 2011 World Cup, that there was an assessment of what the culture in rugby union was. We had the dwarf tossing incidents and the antics of the World Cup, and then the situation at Bath came out with the recreational drug misuse and how endemic it was in that dressing room. And there had to be questions asked about the culture and how these actions were, and these negative headlines and these misbehaviours were happening, because there was no actual punishments being taken. So if there's no punishment for bad behaviour, it rewards the bad behaviour. If you forget what I'm saying. Oh, Zach Hardaker, I'm not a fan. I mean, when he was playing in the NRL with the Penrith Panthers, he was hopeless a couple of seasons ago, and this is the season before his drugs ban. But he's had plenty of off-field indiscretions, assaults, homophobic abuse. He's handed out, drink driving, fleeing the cinema. He's another one. Again, he's exceptionally talented. On his day, he's brilliant. But it's what's going on between here, between the years. There's people around him who are not advising him very well, and yeah, he's not the only player to have been given a drugs ban for recreational drug use. He won't be the last. But again, he's a player who had regular on and off field indiscretions throughout his career, poor disciplinary record, and substance abuse. I raised that when he got his ban. I raised the question about so, but when he was playing in the NRL, he was unfit. He wasn't very good. Yeah, I think there has to be some very tough conversations, and I'm very surprised that the various professional sports aren't coming together with the various governing bodies and coming up with some kind of cross the board action plan, because the amount of negative headlines that are coming out, and yeah, social media has a part to play with the Tompkins incident, for example, and some of Grealish's antics. But at the same time, they are human beings, and they will make cock ups when they're young. But you have to look at how much they're getting paid so young as well. They are getting a lot of money. But drug addiction and drug use, especially recreationally, that mental health has to be considered. We have to weigh it up. And as someone who's gone through, the mental health system and drug rehabilitation, you have to weigh that up. But I think, there needs to be better player welfare, better player management, more transparency with agents, because the player agents, they're the one who sign, get the contracts written up. Player agents, they have a part to play. They're the representatives of these players. And yeah, player welfare. We were talking about the NFL at the start of the stream with Odell Beckham Jr., and then I listed off like how many NFL players and the constant negative headlines about players misbehaving, and the stereotype of their wife beating, gun toting, drug taking idiots. They are. But at the same time, you have to look at the player welfare, and you have to look at how they're being looked after, advised about what to do with their money, positive, intervention, and there's all sorts of questions to be asked. But yeah, there's when players should get suspended, I think there should be more positive pathways for rehabilitation and advice and counselling, and that's again another question that needs answering. The player welfare side of things, the amount of players who are using CBD oil, for example, and the rumour mill going around, especially in the NHL, you only get tested twice a season, once in pre-season, and most of the other tests are done before Christmas. So if you want to abuse recreationally or steroids, you can do it pretty easily in the NHL. That's a known fact. And the debate is being had about CBD oils and other use of recreational drugs and the banned substances, performance enhancing substances. The same debates obviously been had in cycling for years about EPO and blood doping and anabolics. The peptide scandal in the AFL and the NRL beginning of the decade. There is clearly the win at all cost mentality, which is, I think, again, we have to weigh up athlete welfare. But talking about the professional American sports, the big shock to the system was the steroid scandal in baseball. That was the biggest shock to the system when Major League Baseball basically admitted, and players admitted that steroids were a thing for about 20 to 30 years. It was endemic. And the sport hasn't fully recovered from the steroid scandal over the last 20 years. Everyone knew what was going on, but they refused to believe. And when it all started to come out, that has done massive damage to Major League Baseball. The NFL, the amount of players who get done for recreational drug misuse, you'd be surprised. It's a lot more than you think. The NHL, there's been rumours circulating for quite some time that cocaine and ecstasy and cannabis misuse was more widespread than just like players like Bob Probert. Apparently, it was endemic in the league through the 80s till now, more so in the 80s and the 90s. The Edmonton Oilers and the Detroit Red Wings were two teams heavily implicated in narcotic abuse. And yeah, there is a laxity in testing for both recreational and performance enhancing substances, and it's well known. But as I say, these people are human beings. Their careers are a lot shorter than the average working man and woman. Partly why the reason why they get better wages, and we accept that. But a lot of them are massively well paid. And yeah, mental health side of things and athlete welfare, and we discussed concussions and repeat injuries and how that can actually have a serious mental health toll. Has to be considered, and I don't think enough is done. And the fact that now we have an individual payout for the AFL to do with concussion to an ex-player, this could open the door to a whole load of litigation. But again, you have to ask the question: why are these guys not being better advised, better looked after? And the amount of players who've had to retire in these contact sports early because of concussion or repeat injuries. Some of these guys have had careers that last a couple of years and they're done. And it's not for lack of talent; it's because their health. Yeah, I mean, Brandon Sherry, the Cronulla Sharks centre, he got busted at the beginning of the season for a positive test. And it wasn't just one anabolic he had in his system. No, he had 5. And it later then transpired a few weeks later that he had been regularly abusing performance enhancing drugs since he was in high school. So while he's at junior level, while he's a teenager, for 5-6 years. And again, it does highlight issues within sport. Now, a lot of these young lads, predominantly, are encouraged to bulk up these contact sports during their adolescence, and the quickest way to do that when you are going to growth is to put juice into your system. So that in itself is, I think, one of 2 positive tests in the last 12 months that the NRL's had. On the side of withholding wages, there is certain things. Certain leagues have retirement funds where when players retire, they are allowed to access, and a percentage of their wages is held, like in the escrow style system. But again, it's their money; they can spend it how they wish. And the other issues are, I mean, who are you to say what you can? Who am I to say to other people what they can and can't spend their money on? I think what they could do, they need to be better financially advised. These sports make a lot of income. These are multi-million and billion-dollar industries. These are worth hundreds of millions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever currency you're thinking of. And yes, a lot of players, do actually invest very wisely in property, and you will notice that those players that do well in retirement have set up their own businesses. Those who don't stay involved in the sport, they set up their own businesses. They invest their salaries into setting up whatever business it may be. Adrian Morley is now running a recruitment agency. He set up his own industrial recruitment agency since retiring from the game. So, from the NRL and the Super League, Adrian Morley won I think the most dominant forward of all time, possibly the greatest, in my mind, forward of all time in the modern era. Adrian Morley, absolute beast of a player, but he's now got a very successful business on his own right. Others go into the media and do very, very well, and then others like Paul Gascoigne end up really in a bad situation because partly they're badly advised, but also they haven't been looked after, and that's down on the sport. And yes, there's some personal accountability that comes with that, but he wasn't looked after, and his mental health issues went undiagnosed for 30 years. Um, they need better advice on how to invest their money across the board. I'm not saying all ex-players are not destitute, because a lot of them do very, very well in retirement. A lot of them do. But there is a high percentage who end up really in poverty. And it's something that needs to be addressed. And you need to look at, and this is where the topic of salary caps and better club involvement with their players on a social level. We need to have a long, hard discussion about all these issues that we've discussed. But it's not us, the fans, and us, the viewers. It's the actual sports and the governing bodies and the players' unions. They need to have more discussions about these issues, because Tony Adams set up his addiction rehabilitation centre, and he's surprised. What's surprising is it's completely anonymous, but I've seen a documentary on it, and obviously he's famously known for being an alcoholic. But he'd quit drinking by the time Wenger came along at Arsenal, but he was well known to basically turn up to games pretty much drunk. And so in recent years, he's set up, in the last decade or so, I believe, he's set up this he's not had a great success as a coach, but as someone who set up this rehabilitation clinic, it's not for free. You have to pay, but it's a very successful clinic in rehabilitating those with addiction. He's surprised how many Olympic athletes are going in there with problems. We're not talking about high-paid sports stars who play rugby union, rugby league, football. We're talking about Olympic athletes who are on state funding are going in there with issues to do with mental health and addiction. And and for all people go, "Oh, Tony Adams, he's a crap manager." Yeah, he's not very good on the management side of things. As a player, he's brilliant, and as someone who's done a lot of social advocacy in the sense of addiction and being a spokesman for addiction and things like that, he's done very, very well. And the documentary piece that I watched, he said we do get a lot of athletes globally, not just British, globally going there. And you're thinking to yourself, these are professional athletes. Why are there sports that they play in their clubs, their associations, they go not looking after them? Why are they going to an independent counselling service for addiction and mental health when these sports make so many millions and billions every year? That's what's failing, is the sports systems and the sports governments is failing. No, Bayern Munich, they're one of the wealthier clubs in German football. They're on some pretty good wages, those players. But again, I don't know how many tens of thousands of euros a week Thomas Muller's on, but I would reckon he's one of the top paid players at Bayern. I think we have to have the discussions about player athlete welfare a lot more. I was surprised we're discussing so much of this, considering that I was, started talking about, Gareth Bale going to Tottenham and Thiago signing for Liverpool and the rugby league and the NRL with Penrith winning the minor premiership, Brisbane facing a wooden spoon, and now we're talking about player welfare and basically this is where the sports governments need massive reform and transparency. What this lockdown has exposed is these, talking about Foden and Greenwood earlier, and their indiscretions, and Kyle Walker and Grealish, crashing his Range Rover in Solihull and all that. What this has exposed is really weak leadership, especially in football, and weak sports governance. And the fact that if you watch interviews with Tony Adams, he does mention his addiction and rehabilitation centre. That's a private thing. And you're getting athletes and sports stars from a variety of sports, not just football, turning up there seeking help. That is a failure of sports governance in looking after the talent going forward, making sure these guys and girls, because a lot of women are going there as well, are getting the help they need. I mean, horse racing has a massive issue with recreational drug use and suicide and mental health problems. Um, the British Horse Racing Authority doesn't do enough in helping jockeys. There's been a spate of suicides with jockeys who've had to retire because of injuries, mostly in jump racing, obviously, but flat racing as well, and substance abuse. Kieran Fallon is a prime example of a jockey who's had a real fall from grace in public perception in recent years. He's had several cocaine based bans for pumping that into the system. So yeah, again, this is where it comes down to governance and the lack of transparency and the amount of money these sports make. They need to seriously look themselves as the governing bodies, as chair people on the board of these governing bodies and the sports themselves. They need to look themselves in the mirror and go, are we doing enough? Because the amount of negative headlines, and it's not just a British sport, it's across the board. It's across the board. So that's something that needs to be seriously looked at. And this lockdown has exposed a lot of the issues that these sports face. There is a lot of money sloshing around, and it's not going to the right places. It's not going into the right channels. So when you're looking at rugby league, rugby union, ice hockey, football, cricket, the ECB is having to cut 20% of its staff, which is 62 people. It's made massive losses. Where's the TV money gone? Players misbehaving, again, yes. Getting players actively involved in the community and actively involved in the club's functions, away from the training field and away from bits and pieces. The amount of players who literally turn up training and go home. That's what they do, and then they play at the weekend, or they're involved in squad activities if they're rested or injured. But they go to the training ground, they do them, their slot, and then they go home. Yeah, there should be possibly more involvement within club structures, and then post training for post career training and career options outside of the sport. But the problem is, as the sport has become more profitable and more more media coverage, it's very hard for these people to live a civvy life when they retire as well. When they can't just slip into anonymity. There are independent doctors in sport, so teams can't force players back on the field. Do you feel if the sport has its own clinic, they would rush players back? Maybe. I mentioned this earlier when I was asked the question about what rule changes would I bring in, especially with concussions. I think there needs to be more independent, because you always see the team medics go on and assess an injured player. I honestly do think there needs to be more independent doctors assessing, especially head injuries, but also recurring injuries. And I think there needs to be league sanctions. So the FA or the RFU or the RFL saying, well, this is the doctor or the doctors that we're using as the independent non-club doctors to assess injuries and concussions. That is a rule that I would definitely bring in. I mentioned earlier in the live stream, and I do stand by that. I honestly do believe that a lot of players are rushed back from injuries far too quick, and it's a difficult one. It is a difficult one, but there is clearly concerns about player welfare at all times, especially with concussions and repeat injuries. And I'm going to go back to this AFL lawsuit. It's basically opening up a door for further litigation against governing bodies, clubs, teams, you name it, team doctors for failing in their duty of care. It's yes, there's the player's desire not to let his teammates down. I've played whilst I shouldn't have with a crook shoulder, but there's the desire not to let your mates down while playing. And then there really is the point where, like, okay, enough's enough. You are gonna do yourself further long-term damage where you can't heal from this injury. You have to strike that balance. You have to understand that the fight in some of these players, they don't want to, especially rugby players, they don't want to come off because they don't want to let the team down. But then you have to factor up. It's like, okay, can you actually play carrying a slight, niggle? A lot of players do that. But the amount of, again, player welfare, it's a grey area in that kind of respect. But I do think more care needs to take place with players and their well-being and their long-term health, because the amount of ex-rugby players and rugby league players, American football players, ice hockey players who are dying in their 50s and early 60s. I mean, that's well below the average of your 70s, 80s. You know, yes, James Graham initially said it should be players' choice. He's now since changed his viewpoint, because when he initially said that, it was a very divisive statement when they were discussing, the head protocols and the head checks. And initially, we said, I think he goes, it should be players' choice, and that was a very divisive comment. He then, during our off season, took some time away and actually read up and actually went to some doctors and had discussions with the professionals and did some research. And then he came back and said, no, I actually now understand why it should be taken out of our hands. But if he didn't say what he said, we wouldn't have had the debate in the level we did in rugby league. He's now said as soon as he passes away, his brain is being donated to science. He's made that very clear in his last interview before going back to St Helens to finish out his career for the last 6 months before coming back to Australia to live. He said, I am donating my brain to research. But he was adamant in the sense that it should be, how does the player feel? But the James Graham comments, he did say at the time, that's what I believed. I then did further research and actually he went and spoke to the doctors and he went and did the reading up. He's a very intelligent guy, is James Graham. People think rugby league players are a bit caveman. They're not. They're very intelligent. Same rugby union players. They are very intelligent blokes. He went off and, oh yeah, James Graham, I understand his point of view. And it is, I've watched the interview. The interview's brilliant. With James Graham and his statements on that, they were divisive. They did divide opinion. But it's when he came out and said, "I've now done." He's a bit, if he can be outspoken, but I think he does speak it with passion and from the heart and with no malicious intent. But he did go and do the research, and then he read the research, and he spoke to medical professionals about concussions, and he came back, was asked the question again, do you still stand by? I said, no, I've now done my research. I now know that my opinion, while valid, was the wrong way to go. You need to have that independent assessment. So, yes, he does say that, but that his debate was that there needs to be player involvement in the process. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. But yeah, I've seen there's been some pretty terrible concussions in the last couple of weeks in the NRL. I mean, the Brisbane game today, player was knocked out making the first tackle of the game. Done. We're talking about 15 seconds in, he's out cold. Did not return to the field of play. There was a guy yesterday, poleaxed, got up, and he was just done for the day. So there's been a couple of real big collisions, and yeah, players have gone off. And some of the comments on social media, I think, just shows how uneducated a large portion of the populace is when it comes to head injuries. And I always say this: if you keep banging your head, it's not good for you. And as someone who's had a few concussions, it's not good for. If you keep banging your head against the wall, you're going to knock yourself out. I've done that before. It does hurt. If like you keep twisting your ankle, eventually you're going to need. If you keep injuring yourself, it's kind of a it's kind of obvious. If you keep injuring the same area of your body, it's going to take longer and longer to heal. This is why my shoulder is crooked, it's wrecked. So if you keep injuring, if you keep having the same knee get injured, when they keep repairing it, it's going to be weaker. And it can take longer to heal from each injury. So if you keep banging your head and you keep getting concussed, it's going to take longer to recover from each concussion. Boyd Cordner, the Roosters co-captain, he's had, I think, 3 or 4 concussions in 12 months. So there's that debate about his longevity in the game and how many more can he take. And there is a debate about having a mandatory stand-down period. That has been raised. There should be a mandatory stand-down period after a concussion, minimum length, which should be about 6 to 8 weeks. And there should be longer suspensions for headshots in rugby league, rugby union, and ice hockey. Longer, even if it's accidental and you slip up, there should be longer and mandatory minimum length suspensions. So, and again, players playing when they're not fit, like Kane and Rashford, and aggravate. I mean, John Terry played a whole season with a broken foot. Vincent Kompany played a whole season with a broken foot. Cooper Cronk played a grand final in the NRL with a broken shoulder. And this is where I say independent doctors should assess and should have stronger powers to say, this guy ain't going out on the field. This guy ain't going out on the ice. This guy is not, getting in that race car. Because we've seen race drivers have bad injuries from, hitting the barriers. I mean, a couple of touring car drivers have had to take some time away because of concussion-related problems. Eric Almirola, the NASCAR driver, broke his back in a shunt a couple of years ago. Missed a fair chunk of the season. Broke his spine. I think there needs to be a culture shift. There's going to be resistance, but you're paying these guys big money if they're not. I pulled and twisted muscles in my ankle at school, and for a couple of years after, could feel it. I wouldn't want to know what it's like putting it again and again. I've dislocated and broken my ankle. I've torn the quad. I've dislocated and broken my shoulder. Damaged nerves and muscles and cracked the vertebra in my neck. I've broken ribs, fractured a hip. I tell you now, even after you've officially healed, you feel those aches and pains. My back is in a terrible state. I am going to need have my whole left shoulder rebuilt. So I can definitely tell you now it hurts a lot. I've had concussions as well. And I can put hand on heart. Yeah, there are days when I do forget things. I'm 30 and I'm showing signs of concussion-related issues. I haven't had a concussion for a while. I know that much, but in my 20s, I had a fair few. Playing rugby and at work, I've had a fair few concussions. I will tell you now, keep banging your head. It's not good for you. The same can be said about repetitive stress fractures, muscular injuries. Do fans like players get injured and carry on? I think we like a good underdog story or a player battling against the odds, especially in the contact sports like rugby league, rugby union, ice hockey, where a player actually comes out and it's known that they're playing through the pain. But I do think there has to become a breaking point where the pros and the cons, you have to balance up the situation. And in my mind, we have to look after our players more. And we the fans have to buy in on that. We the fans have to buy in on that and say, do we want to see the best players on the field? Yes. But when they get hurt, do they need time to heal? Yes. We want to see the best players on the field. They have to be looked after better. And looking at some of the collisions and some of the injuries in the NRL in recent weeks, there's been a big spate of them this season, more than normal. Some players have had lengthy times on the sidelines, and they've just gone, you know what, you're 75%, you're 85%, you could play, but we're going to rest you another week. There seems to be a change now, a bit of a change in the trend, in the NRL at least, that I've seen, where they're going, seasons past, a player would have come back, they're giving him that extra week on the sidelines. Oh, he nearly lost the sight. He could have lost the sight in his right eye. There's talk about him coming back to play at some point, probably next season, but his shoulder is wrecked, absolutely destroyed. He's in a coaching role right now with the Bunnies, but Burgess comes back, he could risk paralysing himself. His shoulder is in a similar state of mine, but worse. And he's had surgery on it, and he had an infection. He's had drips, and no, he won't be a Super League team. He's contracted the Rabbitohs. No Super League team has the money. He's committed to staying in Australia. His family's based out there. His kids are based out there. He won't want to go back to England. His brother still plays for the team. His older brother, who retired, lives in Australia now, and I think it's George or Tom is playing back in the UK. Probably going to go back to the NRL at some point. But no, I think his left shoulder is completely wrecked, and that's why he was retired. There's been rumours about him coming back to play. I can't see it happening personally because a shoulder neck injury, yeah, that could be end up with paralysis. Goes wrong. But the cheekbone one with James Graham and their head collision, yeah, basically at half time he was the team doctor was like, you shouldn't really want to play on with that, but he played on. Man of the match performance, wins the game. But he basically, because of that injury, it delayed his start into rugby union because he had to have facial surgery, and they said he was lucky not to lose sight in his right eye. But it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one to there is a balancing act. But I say Cooper Cronk played a grand final with a broken shoulder. Should he? Was that if that was a regular season game? Does he play? No. So that has to be considered as well as. Yeah. But yeah, some of these players are playing with some pretty nasty injuries. You just look at the amount of strapping some of these players go out with on their knees, their elbows, their shoulders, their necks, their torsos. Some of the strapping they wear tells you where they're injured, where they have a weakness, muscular or cartilage or whatever it may be. Some of these players do play with minor injuries. Some of them play with some real. They have to pump pain. I mean, Andrew Johns, had broken ribs, and the doctor giving the pain injection punctured his lung, and nearly killed him. And he was playing a whole half a season with like broken rib. I mean, there has to become a point where enough's enough. But attitudes are starting to change somewhat with player welfare. But again, we're looping back to player welfare, and I don't think it's where it should be. Well, it was wobbling around. He got bashed it back into place, but then it started to move, and you can actually physically see his cheek moving when he runs. So it was knocked into place for a bit, but then yeah, it was starting to do that, and you can see it. I think he mentioned he was knocked in the face and that numbed it, and he couldn't feel it at first. But then as the game went on, you can physically see there's blood coming out of his nose and his mouth. It's all his sinuses are all smashed up. The whole side of his face is wrecked. And yeah, that meant when he started rugby union career, he couldn't start straight away, and he missed a lot of time. And his rugby union career, that didn't go so well. And it is what it is. The Sam Burgess story at South Sydney is very, very interesting. The interview he's given and things like that. But that was a fair blow. Oh yeah, I mean the simulation. We'll call it simulation. The antics, the histrionics, the Neymars, the diving, the Ashley Young balance issues, as they were called at the time by Louis Van Gaal. Yeah, that's embarrassing. That is the embarrassing side of sport. And that's where I find these players are paid so much, and it is embarrassing. But unfortunately, it's part of the game now, and I think it's not going away. They're not taking enough tough enough action when players roll around like they've been shot. That for me is an embarrassment on the sport. It generally is, but it's in the rule book to book them. Give a player a booking, but then there'll be no players left on the field by the end. No, I've seen ice hockey players simulate a harder contact, draw a penalty, but then in ice hockey you do that embellishment, you get 2 minutes in the bin. So I've seen rugby players do it, but you generally don't do it because you're going to get targeted for a big hit the next time, by the opposition, and they will steamroll you, and you will then feel it. But I think players like Neymar and others who've got a habit of diving, it really makes an embarrassment of the beautiful game. And this is one of the reasons why I'm falling out of love with sport, because the amount of diving, it is embarrassing to watch, and it's actually cringeworthy to watch, really. And this is what I prefer rugby league, ice hockey, rugby union, because there's none of this really. The antics. There's the occasional player. Oh yeah, in rugby you pretend to be not hurt, when actually you probably got a fractured eye socket or broken nose. Oh, look, with the Neymar thing, I mean, it's so blatantly obvious that it's on camera. It is genuinely embarrassing. And he's been parodied in social media for several seasons now. It's become a meme. It's become it's if he gets lampooned on social media and in the mainstream media, it does get embarrassing. But then the ex-players, there doesn't seem to be the appetite to stamp it out of the game. And it's become an infectious disease. It brings the game into disrepute, but then these players go off and do all their antics off the field that are negative as well. And again, the lack of punishment for their indiscretions. There's a lack of willingness to bring discipline into the sport and to sanction players for their appalling behaviour. But if a rugby player was to try and simulate an injury, that next tackle they're going into, they're getting hurt. If an ice hockey player does that, and they're going to get drilled in a hard body check, that's going to hurt. So, it's an attitude thing. I do think, there needs to be a change in attitudes. Tough conversations need to be had. But I think it's a part of the game that we're not going to eradicate the issue from, because it's been allowed to fester for so long and not be adequately punished, even though it's in the rule book. And I have seen players booked for diving, but if the referees were to actually do that in every game, you'd run out of players. You would run out of players. But it's a thing. It's here. It's unfortunately part of the game, the histrionics. Referees need to be tougher. They have been given instruction in previous seasons to be tougher. The media like to lampoon players, but then the media aren't tough enough on it. I think the whole thing. Oh, yeah, the Harlequins Bloodgate. Yeah, Capsule Gate. Yeah, I remember that. They were trying to cheat the win, though, to take him off, to put another player on to kick a penalty goal. That's why they did it. It wasn't to actually he's faking on to get the penalty. They did it so they could get a blood bin replacement. They were fiddling the rules. They were cheating to get a better goal kicker on, so they could kick the penalty. That's why they did it. They got caught. They got punished accordingly, and they were sanctioned. Football was a lot more. Football was more physical, but the game has changed. The pace of the game has definitely quickened. The art of tackling, players are now afraid to tackle because they know the player's going to dive and the referee's going to give the free kick or penalty to the opposition. So defending has been made more difficult by diving as well. It's a tactic. It's a tactic that teams will employ. Busquets got caught pretending to be hit in the face with Chilwell on camera, and some Spanish people said on Twitter that it's from Real Madrid. Yeah, no, there is that element of some of the European leagues. It's come over here. It's not going away. The referees aren't tough enough. It's in the rule book, but if they were to actually take a tough stance in it, you would run out of players. Oh, the Crazy Gang, they were known for their physical play. Well known for it. Leeds were known for their physical play as well back in the day. There were some teams that were known for being more physical, borderlining assault than others. There was that famous Chelsea Leeds punch up on the pitch, with Osgood and Bremner going toe to toe in the 70s. There was the Battle of Santiago in '62 with Italy and Chile, just it was legalized assault. Yeah, the style of play has changed. I mean, the '82 World Cup final, West Germany, Italy, that was quite a cynical game. The semi-final, France Germany, was quite a cynical game. Um, the '78 World Cup, Argentina, they were quite a cynical side. Um, so were the Dutch, '74 against Brazil. There's some very, very famous World Cup matches where there was pretty. But I've heard about the PSG 5 red card shambles, and they lost the game as well, which is brilliant. I know you take Thiago Silva out of that side, that defence, lack of leadership. There was allegations of racism in the Marseille PSG game. A lot of antics, a lot of heated exchanges. Not a good look. Not a good look for football. There was spitting. There was some pretty. I've seen some of the footage. It's not a good. There was a German player who's been banned for assaulting a fan in the stand. He had enough of some abuse or something. Vinnie Jones, that hit Vinnie Jones makes in the first final. Oh yeah, no, his send off where he just runs over and just gets sent off after 3 seconds. Yeah, there are some of the antics. I mean, the game has gone soft, and a lot of fans are switching off, or get very, very disheartened by it. But until fans start switching off en masse because they've had enough, the players ain't going to change their tactics. And until referees and the governing bodies take tougher stance in it, then. And if Neymar's then, Neymar just brings the sport to disrepute every week. He's not a good role model. There's no doubt Neymar is exceptionally talented and skillful. But unfortunately, his antics and his attitude does bring the game into disrepute. So I've got no sympathy for him, really. He's exceptionally skillful, but his petulance, his entitlement, and his antics just constantly bring the game into disrepute. And referees aren't tough enough. The governing bodies aren't tough enough. And his antics in the last 2 World Cups with diving was ridiculous. But until fans stop watching and stop buying into the antics, then players will keep doing it. And as long as the players keep doing it and aren't getting punished for cheating, then it's going to continue. And yeah, it's no longer seen as the ultimate manly sport. I mean, I don't think any of today's players would have survived in the 80s or 90s. And that's why I think the quality level was better, because you actually had to beat the defender with skill. Otherwise, you're getting taken out. I think you had to generally, instead of diving, you had to hurdle challenges. It was a tougher game. And I think the quality level was better as a result, because the attacking player had to actually use his guile and skill and had to take some fair whacks. And the defenders were better as well. Some of the defending, well, physical. Some of those tackles, the timing of it. I mean, now the speed of the game is such that it does make it hard to defend. Fair enough, but at the same time, the antics of players, including defenders, going down pretending they're hurt, is pretty embarrassing. I don't know what to suggest really, but football does need to look itself in the mirror and work out what it wants to do with itself, because clearly there's problems that are not being addressed. And while fans keep going to games and they keep tolerating it by turning up, nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change. And some fan bases are too fanatically loyal to stop going. Oh no, Colombia were just trying to beat the crap out of Brazil and took Neymar out of the contest. The style of South American play, there is actually a lot of physicality. Back in the day, it was actually a very cynical, brutal. We're talking physical, physical football in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. South American football, Christ, some of the challenges in that were barbaric, and some of the attitudes. But I think South American football is very entertaining to watch. But I do think the quality level of football generally is a lot lower now than what it was 20, 30 years ago. If Neymar was to do his antics back then, he's getting cut in half. He would be kicked out of the sport pretty much, as in the sense he'll be injured all the time because he's too petulant, he's too arrogant, and you're going to have if Thomas Repka, the most disciplined player in history, the most violent player in history, the most red cards. If let's say you got a Neymar versus Thomas Repka, let's say Brazil are playing the Czech Republic in a World Cup game, and let's say Neymar's playing in the generation that Repka was playing in 20 years ago, he's getting scythed down. If Neymar was to do some of the antics where he's doing these unnecessary flicks and he's showboating, Repka is just going to come in from behind, doesn't care if he gets sent off, and he's going to snap his leg. It came in the 90s with the massive increase in wages and the massive increase in TV revenue. It came in the 90s. There were some pretty physical games in the 80s and the 90s, but when the TV money really skyrocketed in the I'm going to say the late 90s, early 2000s, that's where the antics got. That's where this all ballooned out of control, and unfortunately, that's the state of play that the sport is. But if players like Neymar and I feel like who other Ashley Young has his balance. If they were to do that in the late 80s, early 90s, a defender's going to come up, take them from behind, snap their leg in half, and their career will be very, very short. George Best, for example, was well known for having this pre-shin pad days because they only became compulsory in the I think 1992. I think shin pads or 1990. I can't remember which year it was that shin pads became compulsory. But one of his because he was a bit of a playboy, obviously, with George Best, but his legs were covered in scars. He took a kicking every weekend. And he scored some brilliant goals, one of the most skillful players, but he could also dish out a fair bit of punishment as well. He was exceptionally skillful, and the defenders would just try to stop him. And back then, you could get away with some pretty dirty play because there's not TV cameras at every game. His legs were kicked to shit. Pele, 66, the Portuguese thought the only way to stop him is to take him out of the game completely. Same with Eusebio. The only way to stop some of these players was to you're going to have to kick him off the pitch. Yeah, I think football as a dominant sport, football itself has massive problems. It does. The imbalance towards football is TV companies have helped create this imbalance as well. Let's not forget that. The TV companies with their overinflated TV packages and the players with their overinflated wages and the transfer market being overinflated doesn't help. And it is at the hindrance of other professional sports, which are more entertaining, definitely more fun to participate. I'm not sure it will always be the number one sport, to be fair. It's the global sport because it's played on every continent, but I'm not sure it always will be the number one sport. I think there has to be a breaking point, and I think the financial bubble is going to burst. If the players don't want to take wage cuts, then there's going to be carnage because I cannot see the level of finance being sustained long term. If other professional sports that make a lot of money as well are talking about reducing wages, salary caps not rising as quickly as previously anticipated, TV deals not being as big, I can't see football sustaining the level of financial expenditure long term. And the Qatar World Cup will be the real microscope point. That will be the moment where the future direction of which direction it takes. That will be the catalyst of whether it continues to remain on top or if that World Cup is a flop. we'll see what happens. But clubs are going out of business. So if clubs are going out of business, then the model is not sustainable. But we'll have to see what happens. I mean, as long as fans are still willing to overspend on tickets and are still willing to go to their clubs, and their clubs are still recklessly spending money at the top end, and if clubs at the bottom end are going bust, it tells you that things are not right. And we'll have to see what the Euros are like next year, what the World Cup's like in 2022. But I think football needs to address a lot of issues, but there's growing discontent amongst fans about corruption. The player wages are no longer sustainable at the top level, and there's a growing discontent about that. Ticket prices, yeah, there's starting to be a lot of a breakdown in trust between fans, clubs, governing bodies, the players. There's definitely a lot of it's more fractious now than what it was a decade ago. There's definitely a frustration lingering and a boiling resentment lingering there. But we'll have to see what happens. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there because I've been going for 2 hours now. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching and asking your questions. It's been a very interesting one. Thank you very much. I'll obviously have some more videos for you tomorrow and Sunday. But for now, thank you very much for watching. And goodbye for now. And I'll hopefully see you all very, very soon.